Dust coated the wooden platform, thick enough to muffle the sound of her own raspy breathing. Sadie's knees finally gave out, her heavy frame hitting the boards with a dull, hollow thud. She expected the station master to kick her aside. Instead, giant, calloused hands reached into the dirt. The noon sun over Bitter Creek was a physical weight, pressing down on the back of Sadie's neck like a hot iron. She stood by the rear wheel of the stagecoach, her fingers gripping the iron rim so hard her knuckles leached of color. Every breath she pulled in tasted of dried horse manure and pulverized alkaline dirt. Her lungs rattled. Her right eye was swollen shut, a pulsing purplish mass that made her vision swim in sickening halves. Moving was a logistical nightmare. It wasn't just the pain of the bruised ribs, a parting gift from a man who liked to use his fists when the whiskey ran out. It was the sheer, undeniable reality of her own body. Sadie was a massive woman. She carried her weight thick in her hips and broad in her shoulders, wrapped in a sweat-stained calico dress that clung to her like a second, oppressive skin. The corset she had desperately hacked the strings off 3 towns ago still left deep, red gouges in her sides. There was no delicate swooning for a woman her size. When she hurt, the pain was deep, anchored in heavy bone and dense flesh. She let go of the coach wheel. A sharp, tearing agony shot up her left thigh. She dragged her worn leather boot forward, the heel scraping against the splintered planks of the station platform. Around her, the frantic bustle of the depot flowed like water around a stone. A mother in a crisp gingham dress yanked her young son away from Sadie's path, her eyes darting away in poorly concealed disgust. A pair of cattle hands leaning against the ticket office didn't even bother to lower their voices as they snickered, one of them spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice near her hem. She didn't care. The shame had burned out of her somewhere in the Nevada territory, leaving only a hollow, scraping instinct to survive. Just to the bench, she told herself, focusing her one good eye on the weathered oak slats under the awning. Just to the shade. She took another step. Her left knee, already strained from supporting her shifting weight and damaged hip, simply quit. There was no grace in her fall. Sadie collapsed like a dropped sack of grain. Her shoulder slammed into the wooden platform, rattling her teeth. A rusted nail snagged her cheek, carving a thin line of fire down to her jaw. The air rushed out of her lungs in a pathetic, wheezing grunt. She lay there on her side, the hot planks burning through her dress. She tried to push herself up, planting her palms flat against the wood, but her arms trembled and gave out. The leverage was gone. Her body was a dead weight. She could no longer pilot. Well, she thought, spitting a mouthful of gritty dust onto the boards. This is it. This is where you stay. She closed her good eye, waiting for the station master to come and prod her with a broom handle. She waited for the town sheriff to drag her by the ankles into the street so the next stagecoach could pull in. She was too exhausted to feel fear. She just felt an immense, crushing apathy. The sun baked the side of her face. The smell of hot pitch from the roof above mingled with the copper tang of blood welling on her cheek. A shadow fell over her, bringing a sudden, shocking drop in temperature. Sadie didn't open her eyes. "Just leave me be," she croaked, her voice sounding like dry leaves crushed underfoot. "I'll move in a minute." Heavy boots stopped inches from her nose. They were scarred elk-hide, caked in dried mud and smelling strongly of wood ash, raw wool, and old grease. "You're blocking the freight scale." The voice wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was a low, resonant rumble, like boulders shifting deep underground. It belonged to a man who hadn't spoken to another human being in weeks. Sadie forced her right eye open. She saw coarse brown trousers, a heavy canvas coat, and a chest as broad as a barn door. She tilted her head back, her neck protesting loudly. The man staring down at her had a face carved from seasoned oak, half hidden beneath a thick, unkempt beard. His eyes were the color of slate. There was no pity in them, no disgust either. He looked at her the way a man looks at a felled tree blocking his path, a problem of physics and mass that needed to be solved. "I said," Sadie wheezed, tasting copper. "I'll move. Give me a minute." She tried to push up again. Her elbow buckled, her face smacked back into the dirt. A humiliating, involuntary sob tore out of her throat. She hated herself in that moment. Hated her weakness, hated her size, hated the fact that she was going to die a public nuisance on a filthy train platform. The man grunted. It was a short, irritated sound. He didn't ask for permission. He knelt in the dirt beside her. The scent of pine, resin, and old iron washed over her, overwhelming the smell of the station. Huge, rough hands, fingers thick as sausages and hard as stone, slid under her armpits and beneath her knees. Sadie panicked, her defensive instincts flaring. She thrashed, a weak, clumsy flailing of heavy limbs. "Don't touch me! Get off!" "Quit fighting," he growled, entirely unfazed by her thrashing. "You're heavy enough, without making it worse." He didn't swoop her up effortlessly. He couldn't. He braced his boots against the platform, shifted his shoulders to find the center of her gravity, and let out a harsh breath through his teeth. With a sheer, brutal exertion of leverage and muscle, he hoisted her off the ground. She felt his core lock tight against the strain of her weight. She was pressed against a chest that felt like a brick wall wrapped in wool. Sadie froze. No one had carried her since she was a child. The sensation of being lifted, of her massive, bruised body being fully supported by someone else, sent a violent shockwave of panic and something dangerously close to relief through her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning her battered face into the rough fabric of his coat, hiding from the stares of the town as the mountain man carried her away. The transition from the blazing heat of the flats to the biting chill of the timberline was a blur of agonized consciousness. Sadie remembered the rhythmic, bone-jarring jolt of a wagon bed. She remembered the smell of damp earth and the sharp, medicinal tang of crushed pine needles. She remembered shivering violently, her teeth clicking together in a frantic rhythm, until something incredibly heavy and smelling of animal fat was thrown over her. When she finally dragged herself back to wakefulness, the first thing she registered was the silence. It wasn't the dead quiet of a void, but the insulated, breathing stillness of the deep woods. The wind howled outside, a continuous, mournful sound. But inside, the air was still and thick with the scent of wood smoke, curing meat, and strong black coffee. Sadie opened her eyes. The swelling on her face had gone down slightly, allowing a blurry, fractured view of a small cabin. It was aggressively practical. Stripped logs chinked with mud, a massive stone hearth radiating a fierce heat, traps hanging from iron nails, and shelves lined with mason jars. She was lying on a canvas cot. The mattress, stuffed with what felt like corn husks and dried moss, sagged deeply under her weight. She tried to shift her hips and gasped. A sharp, localized pain wrapped tightly around her torso. She looked down. Her dress had been unbuttoned to the waist. Her chemise was pushed up. A wide swath of rough, torn linen was bound tightly around her ribs, holding her fractured bones rigidly in place. Cold horror dumped ice water down her spine. Her breathing hitched, shallow, and panicked. He had undressed her. He had seen her, seen the rolls of flesh she despised, the stretch marks, the mottled, ugly yellow and purple bruising left by Arthur's boots. The humiliation was a physical bile in her throat. She fumbled with clumsy, numb fingers to pull the edges of her dress together, her face burning with a shame so deep it made her dizzy. "You busted 2 ribs." Sadie flinched violently. She whipped her head toward the sound, her neck screaming in protest. He was sitting at a heavy oak table in the corner, holding a small file to the latch of an iron trap. He wore a thermal union suit, stained with soot, his heavy coat discarded over a chair. In the dim light of the lantern, the mountain man looked even larger. His shoulders were wide enough to block the doorway. Scars, thin and silver, snaked through the dark hair on his forearms. "You touched me," Sadie choked out, her voice vibrating with a fragile, defensive rage. She clutched the collar of her dress against her throat. "You had no right." He didn't look up from the trap. The metal file scraped methodically against the iron. "Skirk! Skirk! You passed out in my wagon halfway up the ridge. Your breathing was shallow. Bones were grinding every time the wheel hit a rock. If I didn't bind them, a fractured rib would have punctured your lung." He blew the metal shavings off the latch. Then I'd have a corpse in my bed, and the ground's too frozen to dig a hole. His pragmatism hit her like a wet towel. She stared at him, her chest heaving against the tight linen. She waited for the punchline. She waited for the cruel smirk, the derogatory comment about how much fabric it took to wrap her, or how much effort it took to roll her over. Men like Arthur never missed an opportunity to remind her she was grotesque. But the mountain man just set the file down. He stood up, towering in the small room, and walked to the hearth. He poured dark, sludgy liquid from an enamel pot into a tin cup, then walked over to the cot. He held the cup out. The smell of bitter coffee and molasses hit her nose. Sadie pressed herself backward into the wall, ignoring the flare of pain. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice cracking. He paused, holding the cup mid-air. He finally looked at her fully. His slate eyes scanned her terrified, bruised face, the white-knuckled grip she had on her ruined dress, and the way she shrank away from him like a beaten dog. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a soft, comforting platitude. "I want you to drink the coffee so you stop shivering," he said flatly. "I ain't running a charity, and I ain't running a brothel. You fell at my feet. I picked you up." That's the end of the transaction. He set the tin cup on a wooden stool beside the cot, turned his back on her, and walked over to the corner to pull on his heavy canvas coat. "My name is Gideon," he muttered, grabbing a heavy axe from near the door. "There's salt, pork, and beans in the cast iron. Eat it. Don't touch the rifle on the mantel." The heavy wooden door opened, letting in a blast of freezing, pine-scented wind, and slammed shut behind him. Sadie sat alone in the quiet cabin. Her heart was hammering against her bound ribs. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out and took the tin cup. The metal was scalding hot, warming her freezing palms. She took a sip. It was the worst coffee she had ever tasted. Gritty, thick, and boiled to death, but it burned a path of pure, necessary heat down her throat. She looked at the cast iron pot on the stove. Her stomach let out a hollow, agonizing rumble. She dragged herself upright, gritting her teeth against the pain in her hip and the tight pull of the bandages. She hated that she needed his food. She hated that she was trapped in a cabin with a strange man, miles from civilization. But as she scooped a heavy portion of greasy, salty beans onto a tin plate and took the first desperate bite, a strange, terrifying realization settled into her chest. She was eating. She was warm. And for the first time in a decade, nobody was yelling at her. Frost crept up the edges of the single-pane window, building thick, crystalline borders against the glass. Sadie watched it form from the edge of the cot. Her ribs throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, settling deep into her marrow, but the sharpest pain today was the oppressive confinement of the walls. Gideon had been gone since dawn. He left before the sun broke the tree line, taking his rifle and a coil of waxed rope, leaving behind only the lingering smell of old wool and the ticking heat of the iron stove. She needed to move. Lying still made her mind spin backward, dragging her down into memories of Arthur's heavy fists and the sneers of the townsfolk. Pushing herself up was a calculated negotiation with gravity. Sadie swung her thick legs over the edge of the canvas mattress, her bare feet hitting the rough-hewn floorboards. The wood was freezing. She hissed, bracing her hands on her thighs, and pushed upward. Her hip popped loudly in the quiet room. She swayed, grabbing the back of a sturdy cedar chair to steady herself. The cabin was agonizingly small for a woman of her size. When she walked, the floorboards groaned under her heavy tread. Back in Missouri, Arthur used to mimic the sound, stomping his boots and laughing until his face turned purple. Like a draft horse in the parlor, he'd say, right before he struck her. Here, in the empty cabin, the creaking wood sounded like a klaxon announcing her monstrous presence. She tried to walk lightly, keeping her weight on the balls of her feet, but her bad knee buckled slightly with every step. There was no hiding her mass. She made her way to the wash basin in the corner. Next to it sat a cracked pitcher of water Gideon had hauled from the frozen creek, along with a block of harsh, yellow lye soap. Sadie looked down at her hands. They were trembling. She felt filthy. The grime of the trail, the sweat of fever, and the dried blood on her cheek formed a crust she desperately wanted to shed. She glanced at the heavy wooden door. The iron latch was firmly down. He wouldn't be back for hours. With fumbling, hesitant fingers, she undid the remaining buttons of her ruined calico dress. She let the bodice fall to her waist. She didn't remove the tight linen binding Gideon had wrapped around her ribs, but she pushed her stained chemise down, exposing her shoulders, her thick arms, and the deep, angry purple bruises that painted her pale skin. She poured the freezing water into the tin basin. The shock of the cold air on her exposed flesh made her gasp, her flesh pebbling with goosebumps. She lathered the rough soap between her palms and scrubbed her face, biting her lip when the suds stung the ragged cut on her cheek. She washed her neck, the heavy slope of her shoulders, and under her arms. The water in the basin turned a murky, brownish gray. She was reaching back to scrub her shoulder blades when the metallic clack of the door latch echoed like a gunshot. Wind howled into the room, bringing a swirl of dry snow. Gideon stood in the doorway, a brace of dead, stiff rabbits slung over his shoulder. Panic, absolute and blinding, seized Sadie's chest. She didn't scream. She didn't have the breath for it. She scrambled frantically, trying to yank the stiff fabric of her dress up over her exposed chest, her wet hands slipping on the calico. Her bad foot tangled in the hem. She slammed hard against the log wall, knocking the tin basin off its wooden stand. Freezing, dirty water splashed across her boots and pooled on the floor. She pressed herself into the corner, clutching the dress to her throat, her chest heaving against her fractured ribs. Her good eye was wide, locked on him, bracing for the inevitable. The shouting, the disgust, the slap for wasting water. Gideon stopped. His slate eyes flicked from the spilled water on the floor to the shivering, terrified woman pressed against his wall. He didn't drop his gaze to her exposed shoulders. He didn't stare at the thick rolls of flesh at her waist where the dress bunched. He simply turned around, putting his broad back to her. He unslung the rabbits, hanging them on an iron hook near the door frame. "Wind shifted," he said. His low rumble of a voice gave away absolutely nothing. No pity, no mockery, just the weather. Blew the tracks out, came back early to split more kindling. Sadie stood frozen, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. She stared at his massive back, the thick canvas of his coat stretched taut across his shoulders. He was giving her privacy, a basic human dignity she hadn't experienced in years. "I spilled the water," she stammered, the words tearing out of her dry throat. "Floor needed washing anyway," Gideon muttered. He picked up a split log from the pile and knelt at the hearth, keeping his face turned firmly toward the fire. "Dry yourself off. I brought back some wild onions. We'll make a stew." Sadie swallowed hard. Her hands shook violently as she pulled the dress up, shoving her wet arms through the sleeves and buttoning it to her collarbone. She grabbed a coarse wool towel and dried her face, her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't name. It wasn't relief. It was something heavier. It was the terrifying realization that she was in a room with a man who looked at her and saw a person, not a target. Healing was an ugly, frustrating process. By the end of the second week, the deep purple bruises on Sadie's body had faded to a sickly, mottled yellow. Her ribs no longer felt like jagged knives with every breath, settling instead into a stiff, deep ache. She refused to be useless. The inertia of sitting on the cot made her feel like a parasite. So, she took over the hearth. Gideon hadn't asked her to. He never asked her for anything. But when he came back from checking his trap lines, frozen and smelling of raw copper and pine, Sadie had hot food waiting. She found rhythm in the domestic survival of the cabin. She chopped the tough root vegetables he brought back, rendered the animal fat down for tallow, and kept the fire banked. She was standing at the cast iron stove, stirring a thick, bubbling pot of venison stew. The heat radiating from the iron was intense, drawing a line of sweat down her temple. She reached for the heavy iron handle of the skillet to move it off the hottest part of the fire. She forgot the rag. The blistering heat of the iron seared directly into her bare palm. Sadie cried out, violently jerking her hand back. Her elbow clipped a tin plate, stacked precariously on the edge of the prep table. It clattered to the floor, rolling wildly before slamming into the stone hearth and bending inward with a sharp, grating clatter. The noise was deafening in the quiet cabin. Instinct overrode logic. Sadie dropped to her knees, ignoring the agonizing flare of pain in her hip. She scrambled to grab the bent plate, her burned hand throbbing wildly. Stupid, clumsy, fat, stupid cow. Arthur's voice echoed in her head, clear as a bell. Break my things, you useless sow. Heavy boots crossed the floorboards in 3 massive strides. Don't, Sadie gasped, cowering away, throwing her good arm over her head to block the blow. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'll fix it. I didn't mean to. Sadie. The voice wasn't a roar. It was a firm, grounding rumble. She didn't lower her arm. Her chest hitched in ragged, panicked breaths. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the impact. Gideon knelt in front of her. He didn't reach for her face. He reached out and wrapped his massive, calloused fingers gently around her wrists, pulling her hands away from her head. His grip was an iron vice, but he didn't squeeze. He just held her steady. Look at me. Sadie forced her good eye open, her lower lip trembling. Gideon was inches away. He smelled of wood smoke and the cold. He looked down at her right hand. The palm was bright, angry red, already blistering across the lifeline. He didn't look at the dented plate on the floor. You burned yourself, he stated, his heavy brow furrowing. I dropped it, she whispered frantically, staring at his boots. I broke your plate. I'm clumsy. I take up too much space. I get in the way. It's a piece of tin, Gideon said gruffly. He let go of her left wrist and scooped up a handful of clean packed snow from the bucket near the door. He pressed it directly into her burned palm. Sadie hissed at the sudden, biting cold, but the agonizing burn instantly numbed. Gideon kept his hand wrapped over hers, holding the snow in place. Who told you that? Sadie swallowed thickly. What? Who told you that you take up too much space? He finally looked directly into her eyes. The slate gray of his irises was intense, completely unyielding. Who? Put that in your head. The dam broke. The exhaustion, the pain, the weeks of terror, and the years of abuse finally cracked her wide open. My husband, she choked out, a fat, ugly tear spilling over her bruised cheek. Everyone, just look at me. I'm a mountain of a woman. I'm slow. I'm heavy. I'm just too much. Gideon stared at her. He didn't offer a polite contradiction. He didn't tell her she was beautiful. He didn't lie. You're a large woman, he said plainly, his voice devoid of judgment. He shifted his grip, packing the snow tighter against her burn. So what? The wind out here blows a thin woman off the ridge. The cold snaps a fragile bone. You didn't die on that platform, Sadie. You didn't die in the wagon. You've got gravity. He reached out with his free hand. His fingers were rough as sandpaper, stained with pitch and dirt. Slowly, deliberately, he brushed the tear off her cheek. The calluses snagged slightly on her skin. It was the most intimate, grounding touch she had ever felt. You hold your ground, Gideon murmured, his thumb resting lightly against her jaw. Ain't nothing wrong with a woman who can anchor herself in a storm. Sadie looked at him, the crackling fire illuminating the deep lines around his eyes. He wasn't disgusted by her weight. He respected it. He saw the sheer, brutal endurance it took to carry her body through the world. She let out a long, shaky exhale, the tension finally bleeding out of her spine. She let her hand rest heavily in his, the snow melting between their palms, dripping onto the floorboards. She didn't feel the need to shrink anymore. In the cramped, stifling space of the mountain cabin, Sadie realized, for the very first time, that she fit exactly perfectly. Did Sadie's raw courage and Gideon's silent strength keep you hooked? True romance isn't always pretty. Sometimes it's born in the dirt and forged in survival. If you loved this deeply grounded Western tale, hit that like button right now. Share it with a friend who appreciates a real, imperfect love story, and subscribe to the channel for more gritty, emotional dramas. Drop a comment below. Would you survive a winter with Gideon?